Hi everybody, I'm Donna Brody, I'm the director of the Writers Room. Thank you for joining us tonight in this very exciting evening. We're so happy to have 3 of our members celebrated here, and they're going to talk to you about their work, but they're also going to talk to you about the Writers Room. And Victoria Road is our moderator, so thank you. And
so my job tonight really is to be a conversational spark plug, and let's get all the authors out here. So as the title of tonight's event previewed you, we have Medicine Mystery Martinis. These 3 critically acclaimed authors have all written books that address medicine under the most extreme of circumstances. We have Natural Disaster in the case of Sheri Fink's book, which is 5 Days of Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital, and also her prior book, which was War Hospital, True Story of Surgery and Survival. And then we have Charles Graeber here, whose book is The Good Nurse, a true story of medicine, madness, and murder. And then Doron Weber with his book which is a memoir called Immortal Bird, about his experiences championing his son through a terrible medical misdiagnosis and tragedy. But the uniting thing between the 3 of you, too, is also, of course, the Writers' Room, which is, I understand, something that's been figured, I think, in several of your acknowledgments of your book and been a big part of your process. So why don't each one of you to say what brought you to the Writers' Room, first of all? You want to start with you, Doron?
Well, actually, it's a perfect connection to my book, because the birth of my son, who my book is about, brought me to the Writers' Room since I was in anticipation of a first screaming baby. Being a writer and wanted peace and quiet, I instantly sought a refuge, and a friend of mine had read an article about the Writers' Room. This was about 25 years ago. So I joined the Writers' Room in 1988, worried that with a new child I would not have peace and quiet to write. And I consider the Writers' Room, I now have a day job, which I've had for quite a while, but I consider it kind of my spiritual home as well as my physical home, and I sort of feel like I started out here and I will end up here. In the meantime, I'm doing a few other things.
Well, in fact, we're violating cultural protocol here. You all are sitting in the sanctuary, which is usually silent during the 24/7 availability of this space. So enjoy it while you can. But this is the sanctuary.
Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I think a lot of us here have the connection to the Writers' Room. And for me, it was moving to New York and needing a space and a community. It was a risky thing as a new doctor to kind of give up my career and write a book. And it's funny. I sat down and thought about some of my really close friends here in New York, and I can trace them all back to just a couple key people who I met at the Writers' Room when I first committed to life in New York as a writer, and it was just tremendous. My first book was written here, and I'm delighted to be back.
do we have a second mic? I think it's tucked in your chair.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Merv Griffin. Right. No, the Writers' Room, the Writers' Room is thanked in my book. I think there are probably a number of people here that have shown up for this event, but I'm hugely appreciative of that, who are surprised to learn that the Writers' Room is not a dive bar in the Lower East Side, but it's actually a real place that I was actually going that does have 24-hour access and actual flat surfaces that you're supposed to write on. I'm somewhere in between. I think probably closer to Sheri, in that the Writers' Room for me was a place that allowed me to put on pants in the morning, which I think a lot of writers will recognize is not, precisely, it's not actually, it tells you you're going to start your day, you're going to go have an official part of your day, and then you can leave and have an end to that day. And that's a very difficult process for something that really never leaves your head. And to have a place that's usually quiet, this feels like yelling in a library right now, and it's really strange. And I appreciate that too. A little bit of discipline helps a lot. And like Sheri, I also had a number of conversations with people. I didn't meet anybody for a very long time because you're not even supposed to. And then there's a party at the end of the year, and then I met a number of people who became extremely close friends and gave me great advice. I made turns in what I was doing, determined that I would in fact take on this book, and then ended up spending a lot of time overnights working here, where I could sort of do that nowhere else. Plus, it's got a really nice view of this place. I don't know if we'll be able to see it tonight, but so I'm hugely appreciative of the Writers' Room putting this on, and of you all for helping the Writers' Room put the Writers' Room on.
Well, one thing I've been really struck by, and having known many people who are members of the Writers' Room, is that even though the ethos here is silence in the workspace, that there's such a sense of solidarity through that silence. Like, there's this camaraderie where when you get your coffee in the lounge, that we all are here for this common purpose, and it's an incredibly bonding and career advancing too. I've heard that people pass around notes about their agents and make introductions, etc. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, since I have a microphone, I'm just going to start. Get rid of this. Yeah, I mean, that happened actually. My agent was here, but that's, as you know, I've passed people on from here, made decisions here based on that. You know, writers usually work in total isolation. So, as a magazine writer primarily, I was fascinated to learn what people made a word. I never had that conversation, and I became a bully to my editors as a result, and it actually helped me conserve my time. But that's been. I also think just having people here, looking around, seeing other people working, and you think, well, they're all doing something. I should be, doing something too. It's guilt and fear are the prime motivators anyway. So.
I liked the structure of it, that having to put the clothes on, although my main wardrobe was pajamas for a number of years. And just a joke. Many of but also, it was this idea of, I'm from the Midwest where I grew up. Like, you grow up, you get a job, you go on this career path, and I was on that train, I was on that path, and then to step off it and really wanted to write this book that I was working on, my first book about Bosnia. It was about a genocide. These people had entrusted the story to me, and I felt like I was doing something absolutely crazy to spend years on that, and then coming to New York and finding a community of people who were sitting every day in seriousness and with success doing this crazy thing made me believe that I could do it, and so I tremendously important in my career.
Yeah, I'm pretty much with you. I would say it's validating for you. I had my first book contract and made you feel like, oh, I'm really a writer. It's a legitimate occupation. I didn't necessarily make a lot of contacts here, but I made friends, and that is invaluable. So I'm grateful to the room for that.
So, in all three of your books, whether it's Charlie's book about a guy that has, you said you actually know the exact number of people. He is...
Yeah, I could say, I think, yes. Kind of on an unofficial, yes, I do.
So, he was indicted on 30 counts of murder, but it was...
About 400. There are about 400 names on a continuous sheet of butcher paper that is locked away in a safe deposit box right now.
On butcher paper, irony noted.
Yeah, I know. There is a real number, but one was really all the cops knew, frankly. So.
Yeah.
And the hospitals, yeah. Right. Well, that's
That's
the
problem. Yeah. And then I think it's maybe not as turned up as this one.
Oh,
okay. And then Sheri's book deals with during Katrina, the waters came up, and then they had to do triage and figure out how to deal with allocating what resources there were. And
so in 2005, as many of you remember, the floodwaters that followed Hurricane Katrina drowned one of America's most beloved cities, and the hospitals, just like with Sandy, were allowed to shelter in place when this fearsome storm came and when everybody else was asked to leave. And just like with Sandy, we saw our hospitals here and our nursing homes in very vulnerable positions right by bodies of water, and that was the case in New Orleans. Electrical systems not protected against flooding. So they knew that as the waters rose, they had to get people out. And you can just imagine, like, all the people in a hospital. There were 250 people, 250 patients, 2,000 people in those buildings, doctors, nurses, staff, family members. And as the waters rose and they knew they might have hours of power left, they had to decide who to rescue first. No one was going to drown. It was an 8-story building, but you had these tiny helicopters that could take maybe 2 people at a time. And so that was where this triage began, and they put numbers on patients. They wrote them on the patient's gowns. 1 was relatively healthy, 2 was your typical hospital patient, and 3 were the very sickest, or the do not resuscitate patients. And it ultimately became the 3s who would go last. And the power did fail. It grew very, very hot. They heard gunshots. The staff was afraid. They had brought their pets, because if you work a hurricane, you want people to show up, so you allow them to bring their pets. They started to euthanize the pets, thinking we'll never rescue them. This kind of desperate mindset came in. And then this question arose, what about the patients? We're making the pets comfortable. Shouldn't we do something about these suffering patients? And so the book really is about, how do we value human life in these kinds of circumstances? How do we avoid this kind of thing from ever happening again? And then as a society, how do we adjudicate what turned out my number in my hospital that I wrote, not my hospital, the hospital, that it becomes like you live there for years in your head. About 20 patients received morphine, Versed, or both, powerful sedative and morphine, obviously, and died within a very short time period on Thursday, September 1st, 2005. So the storm hit Monday, and by Thursday, this was the situation. Wednesday, the power failed. 1 day without power, that they were desperate enough. And the question is, is this mercy? Is it comfort? Is it euthanasia? Some of the doctors told me they intentionally hasten deaths. And then what happens when the legal system gets involved, and how do you even begin to apply justice in this situation?
And then in Doron's book, he has a young boy who's got medical complications with his heart, but continues to thrive through one operation after the other. But then things start to go wrong, and do you want to do the summary?
Well, first I would say my book it turns out, the medicine wasn't, I didn't start wanting to write about medicine. I wanted to really celebrate my son's gorgeous character and his remarkable life, and it's only because so much of his life unfolded in the medical arena in a hospital yet that I had to write about it. So it was sort of inadvertent. And when I finished the book, I sent it to a very kind of legendary editor. Some of you know Jason Epstein, who was one of my first readers, and Jason, loved the book, and he wrote me this note, and he said, well, you've done for like healthcare what Jane Jacobs did for cities. Jason had published Jane Jacobs, and at the time I thought, oh my God, I fucked up, because that wasn't what my book was meant to be about at all. It was really meant to be a celebration of my son. In retrospect, of course, Jason's very prescient, and it turns out the book, among the strongest response I've had, is from the medical profession, and it's being taught and used as a study guide at some hospital centers and medical schools, and the doctors themselves of their own accord have taken it to heart. And so that I kind of stumbled into it, but my intention really was not. It was really just to tell my son's story, and it was a simple act of, for me, writing was an act of resurrection, just to bring him back so he would exist in the world, and that was my motive in writing it.
But in all three of these books, the medical culture is completely in CYA mode. They want to cover their asses. They do not want to be exposed. And what I was struck by in reading what I did get to read of all three of your books is how you guys won these people over. They really had no good reasons to want to talk to you, and yet you got information out of them, and you also discerned what was true and what wasn't true, what they were saying. So I was curious about how you penetrated that CYA culture and to do the books that you did.
I don't know that I did penetrate the CYA culture in mine, frankly. Those that spoke to me had a reason to do so, and sometimes that reason wasn't one they would have chosen, given all choices, but they still had a good reason. Charlie Cullen, the serial killer, had a reason to talk to me for a while. It fit his agenda, which was at the time trying to donate a kidney from jail. And A lot of what I learned from him was not what you would call pure, it wasn't murder information, it was really more about him and his life. But then once I started talking to him, the detectives, this was a story, just to back up, this was a story that about it's been called medical misadventure, which is to say that it's a highly litigious situation, and the serial killer himself decided never to speak to the media. He never issued even a public statement to the families of the victims, and he was determined to fade away. The hospitals themselves, and they were engaged in numerous lawsuits, certainly had no interest in speaking beyond a few prepared statements. The lawyers couldn't speak. The victims' families were all bound in these lawsuits, so they couldn't speak, and they didn't really even know very much anyway, frankly. His priest wasn't about to speak, his shrink wasn't about to speak, the detectives weren't interested in speaking. Nobody was talking. And it was there's a bit of a domino effect. Nobody wants to be the only person talking, including the whistleblower or potential whistleblowers in that situation. But once I started talking to the serial killer and continuing to make inroads, then his priest did want to speak, and his lawyer did want to speak, and the detectives did want to speak, and his ex-wife did want to speak, and some of his whistleblowers started to come out and feel maybe that they were bricks in a wall as opposed to standing by themselves. And that aspect was how the COIA culture was penetrated. I also had to be very careful because this is such a litigious situation, and in my book, many readers, let me put it this way, and you'll understand why I put it this way. Many readers come to the conclusion, reading this book, that perhaps the administrators of these hospitals, many of whom were in fact promoted, should be at least examined for criminal culpability in passing a serial killer on for 16 years in 9 different hospitals. I don't say they should be doing that, but my research and the story that is told does lead some readers to think that might be the best course of action. And in order to be able to tell this story, you had to be able to very carefully place those things next to each other because of the COAA culture. And also because of the fact that I'm one person and these are billion-dollar corporations and the heads thereof. I guess that's a sideways answer to that story.
Yeah, well, when I started researching my book, there was an arrest, 3 arrests actually, for second-degree murder, a doctor and 2 nurses for these actions, for some of the deaths. And that wasn't a real good time to speak with health professionals. They were all shut down. They had all lawyered up anyone who was involved at all in the administration of these drugs. Families were very happy to speak. They were, some of them filing civil lawsuits, and then it just took time. I worked on the book for a really long time, and you find that there are times, like you said, when somebody has an interest to speak, and then it was, once the grand jury process was resolved the way that it was, then more people felt free to speak, and I also do think it is, once you have worked on something and people know your intentions and know other people who've spoken with you, that can help as well. And then there were just a couple of really brave healthcare professionals who were willing to look me in the eye and say, yes, we did this, and here's what I did, and here's why I still think it's right. And
so they were being advocates for themselves for what they felt should have been the right protocol. They were not like trying to absolve themselves or confess. They really felt like they had a mission in that.
Yeah, I guess. They wanted to restore, they wanted to defend what they had done and explain it to somebody who was willing to listen and treat them fairly. And that's what I tried to do, was to include their perspectives in the book in the best way possible. And they gave us a service, because to understand, I think it's so important to understand how that thinking could start. Like, these were people who were not, well, some of them kind of are proponents of a more active help in death, which is a very controversial notion in medicine, and flies against current medical ethics for the most part. And then others just said, I never imagined in my life that I would stand there and smother somebody, but I did. And here's why I think I did the right thing. So I guess they were explaining why they believed that they did the right thing, I guess. But it was such a service, because others were just denying that it even happened. And a lot of people in New Orleans had a huge amount of sympathy for the health professionals. And it wasn't even just that, like a lot of them believed that this was just a totally made up claim by some attorney general, you know, who was out to burnish his reputation and thought that he would be very popular for arresting people for preying on the vulnerable in society. What he found was just the opposite, that there was a huge backlash against him and he was voted out of office. And so, you know, that was the situation.
So my son died from a medical error, and preventable medical errors are depending on how you play with the numbers, are from the 3rd to the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. So roughly, again, 100,000 to 200,000 people a year, again, die from preventable medical errors. And that means that while my son was a very unique person, my story is utterly mundane. It happens every day, many, many times a day in hospitals all across America. But even as I'm telling you this now, most of you are not really able to accept it because it's too painful, and you think, well, too bad for him, you know, and hopefully you'll avoid this fate. But what it means is this kind of thing is going on daily, everywhere. And so covering your ass is essential to the survival of these institutions, and to, you know, hospitals are now more about the health business than health care. We all know that, and the system has become dysfunctional. There are a lot of wonderful people, you know, a lot of great doctors out there, but the problem is that, first of all, the threshold for error, if you have one bad doctor, you're in trouble. So I don't know if like Charlie, I don't think I penetrated the CYA culture, but I did, through people like Eric Kandel sitting over there, who's a very prominent person at Columbia, a Nobel laureate, and someone who's a jewel. Eric was able to help me sometimes when I could not get my son's doctor to answer my calls on the day that he actually had a cardiac arrest. I was away in Japan. I managed to fly back from Japan, arrive in the hospital. The doctor had still not arrived, and my son was basically going into what would eventually be the last week of his life, and I could not get her on the phone. So I used all the connections I had, and now I have an actual lawsuit that's still pending 9 years later against the hospitals. Those are the methods I use to try and.
I think she's just adjusting it because it was very loud.
So it's a problem, but it's a problem that all of us are going to have to deal with it at some point, and so people have to become much more proactive in the care of anyone that they care about who goes to the hospital. That would be the message, I think.
Well, clearly, you just beautifully articulated your agenda here is to really expose that medical errors should not happen, and I love that your book is now turning out to be a great tool in education. Do you see anything changing? I mean, I know that your day job involves science and the arts, and you know, your book being a work of literature about science is also a perfect embodiment of that. Do people talk about this with you and the continuing medical response to your book?
I mean,
Medical community response.
yeah, what's interesting is the doctors hear me better than the average person because the doctors know what's going on. So it's amazing to me that I have to say, it's a credit to them that on their own, they've taken, for example, in San Diego, the medical director bought 36 copies of the book, gave them out to all the nurses, the doctors, the surgeons. They would go scene by scene and they say, well, in this scene where Damon's dad or Damon is getting this, what would you do? And they discovered that out of 11 cardiologists, every one of them did something different. And they said, well, maybe we need some consistency. I mean, the most obvious kinds of things. What do you do when his liver function is X or his albumin is at this level? What do you prescribe? And one doctor would say X, one doctor would say Y. They said, well, why don't we figure out what the best thing to do is based on the known data, and let's all agree to do it. Again, very kind of obvious kinds of things, but this was a revelation to them. So those kinds of things I think need to happen. I don't delude myself. One book is not going to change the system. I think it's a positive sign to me that the medical profession on its own is the notion of self-improvement. I don't know too many professions that would do that. That's a testament to them. But I think the system needs to be reformed, and the fundamental reform is that the patient has to be at the center. And as obvious as that sounds, things like continuity of care, having the same doctor follow the patient through all the time, because you get lost in the shuffle where they tell you that, oh, we're all interchangeable. I mean, you need to have one doctor that knows what the normal baseline is, so when there are changes, they can track those changes. You need to have them stop looking at the computer and look at the patient, like literally direct observation of the patient. They would come in, they would miss things, like my son had a thrush infection, and we'd say to them, which led to really serious problems. I said, well, how could you miss it? And the doctor said, oh, it was dark in the room. I mean, I don't know what kind of, and things like that are just absurd. So
Maybe
really,
with Katrina when the power was out. But they could turn on the light because we were.
And by the way, you all should be thinking about your own questions, because we're going to open it up, maybe 15 minutes or so to you guys as well. But in your case, I know right up through the epilogue you're talking about, like, okay, when the backup generator goes down, what do we do under disasters? And in her epilogue, she talks about more recent disasters and hurricanes where the protocols really, yeah.
Wait, first I have to say that Dr. Kandel is my idol, and I'm very honored to be in the room because I studied neuroscience before I became a journalist.
She has a PhD in it.
So thanks. It's great to have a room of eminences to speak with. But yeah, so I think I was hoping that the book would be, and it's not just about doctors and nurses and hospital staff. Really, it's a few things. One is that anybody could be, any of us could be a patient or have a loved one in the hospital if a disaster strikes. But it's also a lot, what I learned a lot by writing the book was, and really going almost hour by hour through, just like you, like these decisions that one leads to the other, leads to the other, and in the end you have this thing that, nobody would really want 20 people to die who didn't need to die. However you feel about the action that the people took, you don't have to judge them necessarily, but that it happened is awful. And so what can we learn from it? And there's all different levels of it. There's an infrastructure level, which is like, do we need, through learning what can go wrong in these rare but foreseeable disasters, do we want to invest some more of our public dollars or our private company dollars into preparedness? And it's a valid question. New York City has instituted a lot of reforms since Sandy. It's always after the disaster. And there's this question whether our hospitals should be retrofit and our nursing homes should have their backup power systems protected against flooding. Of course, new construction now, we have higher standards, but it costs a lot to protect the old hospitals. So do we, as a society, do we want to support when the city council votes on that? Then there's just the whole organizational thing, whatever organization you work in, how do you think about what would we do in a crisis? How would we keep things going? In a hospital, these people didn't sleep for days. There weren't good shifts. There wasn't good communication. The leadership structure broke down. How can we prevent that? And then on an individual level, every one of us can prepare and sort of walk through what is the worst case scenario. What are the likely disasters in my neighborhood? Who's vulnerable in my apartment building? Can I knock on doors? Thinking about that. And what I really learned is that it is the actions of each of us, the people in the immediate vicinity of a crisis, who really make the difference between life and death in those early hours, because it takes a while for official help to come in. And a lot of times disasters are like blinkers, like you can't, this idea of situational awareness, disaster nerds have all these names for different things, but this ability to see the larger picture when you're in a crisis, it's a very hard thing to do, but having a plan and then being prepared to change that plan, having that flexibility, looking for more resources when it seems at first that you don't have enough for everyone. And it's amazing, there are all sorts of examples in the book of positive things and the ways that helped. And so that's my little advocacy note and what I hope people will take away from it.
And you were mentioning to me that there are now Cullen laws.
Yeah, this is a tougher one for me to follow up on. Right, for exactly that reason. You're right. It wasn't. This was, I guess, more akin to a natural disaster than a systemic failure, although it's something of a combination, because nobody expects or should expect that their coworker or husband or father or best friend or employee is a serial killer, let alone the largest serial killer in American history. So this is an unreasonable expectation. You can prepare for it, but it just seems hugely cynical, really, to really prepare for something quite like that. I mean, you can. There's some middle ground between. So it's a little different in that regard. However, one of the many failures that happened here, well-intended though it was, simply passing on neutral references from hospital to hospital, which happened time and time again, where Cullen would be caught at something, there would be a, well, what the reader, I think, would usually argue, would be a high likelihood that any reasonable person observing these events or knowing of them would have serious concern for patient welfare. Some truly bizarre things, including stashing, or the discovery that empty bottles of vecuronium bromide, which is a dangerous paralytic, are found in the trash. Charles Cullen is clearly the one doing it. Nobody's prescribed vecuronium bromide on the unit. A little bit goes a long way, and none of it's prescribed. And there are people dead that night. They get rid of them. They allow him to quit. They bring an outside attorney in, and they allow him to quit that night rather than be fired. And he's moved on to another hospital. The hospital administrators call their friends and ask questions about him and tell those friends at other hospitals not to hire Charles Cullen. They don't tell the police. They don't tell the nursing board. And they don't tell his next employer, where he goes on to kill another 16, 18 people, depending on how you count it. So, in the wake of Cullen getting caught, I mean, this is the thing about Charles Cullen, everyone always says, and also he's not a mercy killer. I should probably correct that in case you don't know. This is nothing, this is just a habit.
Yeah.
This had nothing to do with the individuals.
Noble.
Well, no, there was, or even a justification. I mean, that was presented really by the detectives later, as they just, they were more, they wanted to give him a reason to say yes, as opposed to, find the reason. But yeah, Cullen laws, so-called, have been enacted in New Jersey following his capture and arrest, and they've been enacted in 37 states, and they theoretically make it easier for whistleblowers to blow the whistle. And they compel the hospitals to also report what they know. And but that compulsion, we were just at a national meeting of state boards of nursing, Sheri myself, and the Deputy Attorney General of New Jersey was there addressing exactly this. And the questions that came up were, well, what happens when the hospitals don't report? And she didn't really know. And the answer is nothing, really. I mean, compared to knowing for sure you'll be sued for hundreds of millions of dollars, the answer is nothing. So really...
It's acknowledging that patients died.
Right, because to say, yes, we had a dangerous person working on our staff and endangering the lives of our patients is a guaranteed payout situation. I mean, just more, forget every other element of this. It's a horror. That's another aspect of this book, was finding people who have done a good job by the very, very narrow definition of what a good job is for them as risk managers, as people protecting the liability of their corporations, but they had not done good. They'd done probably the opposite of good. So I'm not sure that how much has changed. To date, there's one bad guy in jail who was bad, and there's, even though the detectives who discovered him asked for a grand jury to at least look into culpability by any of those administrators, that grand jury was denied on a political level, and to date, people have only been promoted for what they did.
I was very struck in Doron's case that you were in a grief support group where the other parent's child had also died in the hands of your son's physician or expert.
Yeah, that was a kind of freaky, fluky kind of thing. We went to a grief support network, and they only had about 5 other families there, and it turned out that, yeah, one of the other families had lost a child at the hands of the same physician. However, and I know nothing about their case, and they did not, it's very painful to accept that when you lose someone that it didn't have to happen. So it's much easier to believe that, well, we tried everything, but fate, nothing could be done. And so this mother believed that everything had been done, and the explanation she gave me on the face of it, well, you're a sophisticated group. I mean, so basically, it's that it was a heart transplant situation, which my son had, and essentially there are two major risks in heart transplants: rejection and infection. And the treatment is the opposite. So if it's rejection, you need to up the immune suppression so the heart doesn't reject the organ. And infection, it's the opposite. You need to reduce the immune suppression and let the body fight with its own defenses. So if you, in my son's case, they treated him for rejection when in fact he had infection. So not only didn't they help him, it's as if they pinned his arms behind his back and didn't let him fight with his natural defenses. In the other woman's case, and as I said, I know nothing about the details of the case, but the mother, this hospital, my son, was obsessed with rejection. And so even though her son, you test negative for rejection, they say, well, it could have been rejection in a different part of the heart, which is essentially like saying the test means nothing, because if it's positive, it's rejection, but even if it's negative, oh, well, it could be in a different part of the heart. So, but that's an easier explanation to swallow, because then you believe there was nothing we could have done. So again, I don't know the details of her case, but I believe there may be she might have been a victim of that kind of thinking, which makes absolutely no sense.
I work a lot with authors about their process, and in all three of your books you did tons and tons of research. I was curious about how, especially over these years, how you tamed that research to make it shape. All three of your books got great reviews for being such great page turners and being breathless, and they're 500 pages long, 500 pages long, and that's a long book, and they're really compelling. And I was curious about how you managed to tame all your research and make it shape.
I actually didn't do research, so I had to just frankly dig into like the deepest. I had to remember, but there wasn't the story. I lived it, and it's a very personal story. And the only thing I discovered was that nothing is ever lost in the mind. And even if you begin at the start of the day and you say, "What do you remember about the scene?" and you think nothing, you just sit there and you concentrate and you focus and you go into deeper and deeper states. At least for me, by the end, I felt like I was peeling away the layers and really able to enter back into that, so that it felt like I was recording it verbatim. But I honestly lived it so deeply. It took me a long time to write it. I have a day job, but also it was so painful that there were times where I literally had to get up from my desk, and it was like someone had punched me in the stomach, and I just had to lie down and recover. And that's what took me a long time. But the research was, for me, I can't take any credit for doing research.
Well, it seemed like you must have had retraced steps, so I'm very impressed with your powers of memory, because there's this incredible scene at his son's end of life. It's just incredibly vivid, so I'm very impressed. Do you want to speak?
Sure, yeah. So I did, by the end of the process, I did a magazine article, which took, 2.5 years. Of course, I worked on a few other things at the time, but it took a long time, and then the book was like 3 years more on top of that, or plus some. So it was a mountain of research, and there was interviews, and then a ton of documents, court documents. There were civil suits, there was a criminal suit. I collected photographs, videotapes, whatever, and so kind of use the techniques that I learned in the writer's room and other places about narrative nonfiction, and how you craft a story that makes sense when you have so many potential characters and whatnot. And it is a real challenge, because it's not neat in the way that you would like if you were writing fiction, but it's doable, and there's lots of good models for it. And so I stuck with a mainly chronological organizing principle, because that our brains, if it marches forward in time, at least that part is consistent
And natural
constant.
suspense.
And and suspense too. And then when I would go from, let's say, one person, I tried to write each part through somebody's perspective, so that you're mainly seeing it through somebody's eyes at that particular time. And then if I was going to jump to another person, I would keep, either time and place constant if I was switching person, or, just the techniques that we learned. If you're going to jump in time, at least keep it with the same person in the same place, etc. Those kinds of techniques. And I kept a running timeline. So now you can do it obviously on a Word document. I would interview somebody, and I would plug it all in. You know, she went to nursing school in '78. She worked at this hospital starting in this year. She knew this person then, and you start to see, if you plug it into a chronological timeline, a timeline is chronological, I guess, then you start to see these relationships between people and events, and so that was tremendously useful as well.
Well, just in terms of the organizing principle of speaking here, I've got to tell you, it's really hard to go last. Because you either listen to what other people are saying, which is really interesting, or you think about what you're going to say, but you really can't do both. So I think I probably did neither as a result, but I learned. I'll still approach the question. Yeah, this
Were
is
you able to think while you were saying that?
Yeah, halfway actually. Thanks for put it all together.
We'll buy you some
I put
time.
That was a big filler. Yeah, thank you for noticing that. That's exactly right. So yeah, now I've got it. Kind of ruined my bluff, but I think that's all right. Yeah, this was a kind of a monster. It took 8 years, but essentially the same kind of timeline that Sheri just talked about, in that it was a little thing that turned into a relationship with a serial killer, that turned into a magazine story, that turned into a, holy crap, this is something much more than this simple, well, not simple, but this very weird story about a serial killing nurse attempting to donate a kidney from jail. There's actually some important stuff here as well about, there's some whistleblowing stuff. There's a bigger story, and it's going to take forever to tell it. To a massive fact-gathering operation that I didn't even know how to approach, except to grab everything I could all the time, which was a bit of a panic sometimes. In fact, I can still clean up. I've got a locker back there, and whenever I didn't know what to do, I'd go to Staples and I'd buy, things to organize all the things I was going to learn. So, I had little note cards on drugs and things. And in the end, the only thing that worked was going absolutely insane. And plus I was, by the way, getting every wire over here. The detectives were feeding me stuff. I was getting secret documents from all sorts of people at every videotape. The only thing that worked is to upload everything into my active RAM and to vomit it out, finally. And it was a much longer book at one point. But now it's a relatively, it's a medium-length book with a lot of endnotes. But yeah, managing the chaos was the difficult thing, and finding a through line. Because this was the trick with this for me. It wasn't the truth, because the truth was always there. And the fact that this is probably the big obvious secret of nonfiction. The truth is, the world is nonfiction. I'm not going to get into a philosophical thing here, but trying to make a line through that tells a story that anyone can understand is really, really hard. And that was the trick with this, is just trying to figure out the little bright spots to illuminate along the way that could tell a fairly complicated story that involved drug interactions, and there were no chase scenes, there was nothing active happened, but it was all important. So that was the real trick, and that took forever.
I just want to respond to that comment about the world is nonfiction, because I think that's true, but it's also true. There's a favorite quote of mine from T.S. Eliot: "Mankind cannot bear too much reality," and I think all of us in the stories we told, we held back things, right? There's just, you cannot, as terrible as it's always worse than what you can say. You have to figure out, as writers, you have to figure out how much the reader is going to be able to tolerate. And if that's where the art comes in. So we don't, I know it's got to be true for you guys. You do not give them everything, because they would, well, first of all, it would be infinitely long, and it would be too much to bear, I think.
The horror. Yeah, I was just going to make a pitch for cork boards and little pins and tiny pieces of paper, because even stuff on the computer, like that visual tactile thing, was really helpful to do. For each chapter I started.
I know a lot of people swear by the corkboard or butcher paper, or really, I've seen timelines sometimes go across people's whole apartments. And you guys did not use researchers, you did it all yourselves.
I did
Wow.
research. I wish I did. Trying to figure out how to get a researcher would have been research, and I was.
I had a little help. I had a couple fellowships, similar to the writers' room. I had to move to Washington for personal reasons during part of the time that I was working, and I applied for, there's a couple fellowships there. The Wilson Center is a good one for and also New America Foundation has the public policy scholarships, and they both came with, they would have researchers there who could help. So I did use a little bit of help, which was helpful. The help was helpful. Yeah.
Do you think it's time maybe
Yeah.
we can start to open it up to the
Of
audience?
course.
Great.
So,
Please say them, and if Victoria hears you, she'll
Yeah.
repeat them.
go ahead.
Hi, I was curious if any of you were toying with the idea of telling your stories through fiction as opposed to nonfiction.
Tempted to tell it in fiction versus
I'm so
nonfiction.
glad you asked that question because I just got a book from a publisher, maybe, hopefully, maybe the editor's here, I don't know. But, and it's a forthcoming book which will remain nameless, but the person who wrote it described it as a work of fiction in the introduction, but it was sent to me with a cover letter from the editor making it clear that it was being marketed as nonfiction, as sort of like memoir-ish. Nonfiction composites, which is like an oxymoron for anyone who, spends 6 or 8 years, like you don't mess with truth and then market it as nonfiction. I feel pretty strongly about that. So, no, I think definitely not in my case. No, I felt like the truth was what we needed to find. Like, there's so many, if you think about, have you ever heard of like at wartime people doing mercy killing, a doctor killing a patient? You can find very few or even maybe no actual cases of that. Like, it's all in movies, and there are ethics exercises that are done like at the military medical school, but they weren't using real cases. So to have to really be able to zone in on what actually happened in this mind-blowing story, I wasn't at all tempted to fictionalize it. And I think that in terms of craft, like there's totally a craft to literature and fiction, but I think also the sometimes boundaries promote creativity. So if you have the boundary of the truth to work in, that also I think you can create art that way. And so I like to read nonfiction. I don't like to read memoir because I think sometimes people take liberties with the truth.
I never, since I wanted to bring my son back to life, so I never considered fiction. However, I was working on a novel before I started this book, and I would say that because I write fiction or try to write fiction, the craft of writing fiction helped me inordinately to tell this story, because I had to keep in mind that at the end of the day, for the reader, it had to be a page turner, and the reader had to be interested in whatever my grief or anger or my complex of feelings could not interfere with the story. And so I used a lot of the techniques I had learned in terms of creating scenes, dialogue, and varying, changing it up all the time, so it would be, frankly, something that you could get through. So that it helped me. The fiction, the technique of writing fiction helped me, but I never considered writing it as anything but nonfiction.
Yeah, once again, somewhere in between the two. I tried to use the full palette available to the writer, which includes the writer of fiction, but everything but making things up. I mean, the fact that it was true was really the only important thing of this whole story, and that was truly the challenge, was to find the truth, to lay the truth out, to actually make it readable, and to make it comprehensible, and to present it with the so what, without editorializing it, and without it being dull, frankly, because I give up on books if I don't like them, and I didn't want that to happen here because it needed to come through. I also, in fact, I needed to be so strict about it because I was, again, this is the sort of book that I could get sued for constantly. So, if I say it was raining and someone's shoes were brown, it was raining and their shoes are brown. It had to be that way because, in fact, that's what's happened. Is I knew that I was never going to be attacked on the big points, which is to say those points about what administrators perhaps knew or what the life and death stuff. But I was going to get attacked on the weather, and I've in fact gotten attacked by one of the hospitals on whether or not Charles Cullen considered St. Luke's, which uses a Star of Bethlehem as the apostrophe in the Luke's, to be a Catholic hospital, which is his perception, not mine. It was it's sort of beside the point, if you will, but it's a way of getting around the major question. In terms of everything about it as a fiction, no, if I had to make this fiction, I would never, this is the most boring serial killer in the history of fictional serial killers, in that, you know, nothing explodes, everything's internal, it's, you know, drug reactions. He's quiet, you know. I would never make this guy up, and it's very funny actually. My girlfriend is her family knew I was working on this for years and years, and I'd be you know, working on this in front of them as they were having fun in Maine, and they're trying to figure out who I am, and it was only after the book came out that I realized that they thought it was a work of fiction this whole time, and I just had it was such a testament to their faith in me, that they were still willing to think I was okay, even though I was I would be willing to make up a medical serial killer with no he wasn't wearing human skin, he wasn't blowing it, you know, there's no craziness to it at all. I never would have guessed that, so yeah.
The first draft of the book cover for 5 Days at Memorial, it was black and red, and the letters were red, and they were dripping, and it looked like a slasher novel. I love the cover that they ended up with, which is looks like wet paper. But I was just going to give a nod to, of course, you know, there's no monopoly on the truth, and the truth is very difficult to find, even when you're trying to write nonfiction. And you really you developed such a respect. Sorry, Victoria. For the fallible nature of memory, and I'm sure we all struggled with that. Every nonfiction writer does, and I say that I don't like reading memoir because it's all, you know, a lot of stuff is made up. But when I interview somebody and they're filling in the history, it's really in a way the same thing. I'm quoting them exactly, but I'm quoting what they're saying about something, and there's all sorts of motives for why they say it, and when you work on something for many years, people forget things, and it's really hard, especially when you train in science and you want to triangulate evidence and, you know, really believe something before you print it. It can be frustrating.
Anybody? Yeah, go ahead. At what point in the writing of your books did you come upon the titles, and what was the process in the title?
How did you come at your titles?
Actually, that's lead me into making a comment about your truth. So I would say the twin poles for me were truth and beauty. So how, like in my case, to tell the story with unblinkingly, but also to find some beauty in it. And so the title of my book, Immortal Bird, comes from John Keats. Of course, Keats' famous dictum was truth is beauty and beauty is truth. I mean, there were other reasons. You know, my son, well, Keats died very young at 26. He also had red hair and was short like my son, and they both had a way of living life so intensely and so fully in their short span that you know, I was drawn to Keats for that reason. And then my son also had some bird-like qualities, and of course Ode to Nightingales is a beautiful title, and I had to have that title at the beginning, and then a couple of people, famous people, even writers who love my book, said, "Oh, that's a terrible title. You know, you've got to change it." And for a while, I thought, oh, and my agent didn't like it. And then I was kind of playing around with new titles, and then my children said, "No, don't change it, Dad. You know, we got to keep it." And so that was it. That was the end. So I fought for the same title I had from the beginning, and I'm happy I did.
My agent slapped it on the proposal. I never liked it. And it just kind of became that. And but it's really kind of 4 days, because like the storm hit early Monday morning, that's 1, Tuesday is 2.
Fact-checking your own title.
3, Thursday is 4. But they came on the Sunday, so I guess it's kind of like that. Anyways, I never was that happy with it.
Wow, that's a great answer. This wasn't the title of the book in the beginning. There were a lot of titles. I like this title. The title was the last thing. It's the easiest thing to think of is the title if you're not going to write the book. I guess I put it that way. At the very end, then, I don't know, whatever works. That was my feeling about it. The thing about this title that I do like, and I know this is sort of avoiding the question, but there are a lot of other obtuse titles that I had, The Rule of Nines, Red Bull, that had different approaches and different focuses. What I like about this is that it's not, you know, it's called The Good Nurse. I'm not being sarcastic. right? It's not, you know, he's not really good. It's the fact that that's a there are a number of aspects of it, but one is that it's a cartoonishly simplistic, overly simplistic approach to thinking about any human being. It's a Halloween costume of a title, short words, and behind that Halloween costume are real human beings, and it could be the Catholic
Are real
Church.
monsters.
Yeah, I don't believe in monsters. I would say real human beings that with maybe bad intent, bad habits.
I would say after hearing you talk about him.
Yeah, I know. That's a whole different. But that was the genesis of the title, and it's worked. I like that it's simple, but
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you can answer this question, Doron. And Doron's book is the only one I read, so I can talk to that particularly. There were a number of cases where you didn't identify somebody for obvious reasons, for protecting their identity, and I'm wondering, after the book came out, whether anybody came forward or said anything to you, recognizing themselves.
People coming forward afterwards.
There are only 4 doctors directly involved in my son's care that led to his death, whose names I changed at the last minute on the suggestion of the Simon & Schuster lawyer. And they didn't force me to do it, but when I mentioned to you how many hundreds of thousands of people have the same tragedies that happened to me, but very few books, very few stories get out. And it's hospitals are healthcare is the largest industry in the United States. It's bigger than defense and oil combined. It's very powerful, and to take them on, I had a libel lawyer, speaking of, go over every page of my book and challenge me in preparation for them coming after me, and because they could just, they would just be able to bleed me, by just suing, I wouldn't be able to defend myself. So I had to be really super careful, and nonetheless I did get the story out, and so I didn't mind changing the names of those doctors because everyone in the profession knows who they are, and in fact, and I've heard about that, but you don't need to know. It's not like I didn't want to humiliate them in front of the average person. That wasn't I didn't write it out of that kind of impulse. So, and in a funny way, had I used their real names, they would have turned themselves into victims and said, oh, it's about, and it wasn't about them.
But what about warning future patients, though? Did you ever think about that aspect?
Yes, it's one of the reasons I have the lawsuit. The book was the beautiful thing I did, the lawsuit's the ugly thing I did, and the aim of the lawsuit was actually to, if possible, take out the person who I thought shouldn't be practicing medicine. And people know who, even one of the editors at Simon & Schuster had a friend at another publishing firm who knew exactly the doctor I was talking about and said, oh yeah, we had a bad feeling about her and we left, because of, so I think people, it's a small world, and once you get this kind of diagnosis and you look into it, people will know who it is. So I wasn't, I think the word has, it has to.
I kind of struggled with this a little. I don't think I've ever told this story, but there was, so pretty much everybody's named in my book. There aren't any pseudonyms. There are no pseudonyms. But there was one nurse who the investigators, the criminal investigators, really thought was very involved in the administration of the drugs. I had a few sources who kind of confirmed that, but she had not come to public light, like her name's never been out there. And there was just a little, there's definitely stuff I could say about her. I could certainly say she was investigated, they went to the Texas Board of Nursing because she moved to Texas, blah, blah, blah. And that question of, and when I called her, of course, to get her side, she begged me not to put her name in the book. And of course, there are a lot of people who didn't want these things to come to light. And I totally struggled with just, I felt like it's compassionate to her to leave her out. But like, what if she is like this really, like, do people have a right to know that this person who they may entrust their care to was involved in this with great likelihood? So I really struggled with that one person. And that she's not mentioned, because in the end I felt that there was just that bit of question whether she really was involved, and therefore, but I struggled with it. I don't know, did you?
I would have been fine changing every name, with the exception of a few, because it was more of a cautionary tale. But there was really no point. The names were already out there. The names I really wanted to get out there were the only dangerous ones that were all fairly boring, in that they were administrative names, and it's all on the end notes. And those are the ones I had to be most cautious with. I was asked, for no good reason, to change by the serial killer's ex-wife to not use her name, and I tried to explain to her that was silly. There was a thing called Google, and that this was going to, but I didn't see any harm in it, because because it didn't matter. So I went ahead and did that and made a note of it. The only people whose names I absolutely protected were the names of his children, and they don't appear anywhere. Well, they appear, but their names are, actually, I named them after some people there in the room. But just to keep them straight, because I could remember what they were, because they were so arbitrary, because I knew the real names. It was really hard for me to remember them. So I did that as a shorthand, and I don't know if I changed it or not, but I don't think I did. The only other thing I'd say about pseudonyms, and well, there were a few people that I had to protect because they were whistleblowers, and they came to me and they gave me sources, and I had to bury that. And a few others that had come to me, and this is a regret. This is the difficult thing. There were people that were public record, and I had a great deal of information about them as family members of victims or victims who just felt, for the most part, the reaction was, thank you for looking into this, thank you for memorializing this, thank you for speaking truth to power. In a few cases, the rage of having their child killed by this guy was so great and so unresolved that I got a little bit of a backlash on that, just because I, talked about them, and talked about them in casual terms, because those were the terms in which the killing happened. So that sticks with me. I think it was the correct move journalistically. I think it was an okay move, I guess, journalistically. It was maybe and stylistically, I know it was the right move, but it sticks with me as a person. I feel badly about it.
I think this is a good stopping point for this part of the evening, but everyone is
kind of a downer, though.
But I want you all to have a chance to connect with our authors personally. We have more food coming out. So thank you to our registered members and authors. And thank you.